Not long after I first converted to Christianity from an atheistic worldview, I recall having a conversation on a college campus with someone who believed that Jesus never really existed. Since this person obviously denied the historicity of the four Gospels as well as other important New Testament texts, I thought it might be a good idea to mention the famous passage about Jesus found in the writings of the first century Jewish historian Josephus. That's when I first discovered that not everyone accepts this passage by Josephus as authentic. Though it was included in Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, my conversation partner that day informed me that this passage about Jesus was a worthless addition, something that a Christian copyist added to the text of Josephus many centuries later. Since that time, I discovered that this isn't merely a non-Christian way of dismissing what has come to be known as the Testimonium Flavianum, which is the fancy scholarly way of referring to this passage about Jesus purportedly written by Josephus. In fact, many Christian scholars argue that this passage, though probably not a complete forgery, has been interpolated or slightly massaged over time to make it sound as if Josephus said much more about Jesus than he actually did. This is the view of Cambridge scholar Richard Bauckham, who I've interviewed on multiple occasions. Because this passage from Josephus is so questionable, as he explains in this audio clip, he has chosen never to use it.
That passage specifically about Jesus in the Antiquities, I think it is so problematic. I avoid ever appealing to that passage because the people who say Josephus wrote something like that then have to argue, well, it's been adapted by Christian authors and so on. I think it's better to forget that passage. It may well be a complete interpolation by Christian scribes later on.
I discussed this topic in some detail way back on episode 12, which featured an interview with Josephus scholar Paul Meyer. With Bauckham, Dr. Meyer argued that the Josephus passage about Jesus had been interpolated, but he also added that an Arabic manuscript had been discovered that preserved the original reading. Dr. T.C. Schmidt used to be convinced of this view, but after his own detailed investigation, he is now arguing in a brand new book published by Oxford University Press that the Testimonium Flavianum has been largely misunderstood. In fact, he presents compelling new evidence that this passage about Jesus is not, in fact, a later addition, or that it was ever intentionally altered by later Christian scribes. His new book is titled Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. So before I begin a new series on the Gospel of Luke, I'll be taking a closer look into the world of Josephus as I talk with Dr. Schmidt about his investigation and how he became convinced that the famous Jewish historian really did write about Jesus.
Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome back to the Humble Skeptic Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Rosenthal. As I mentioned in the introduction, on this program you'll be hearing from Dr. T.C. Schmidt, author of a brand new book published by Oxford University Press titled Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. This book is set to be released here in the U.S. later this month, but I should warn you in advance that it has a hefty price tag. If you'd like a hard copy of this book, it'll cost you over $100. However, later in the program, I'll let you know how you can get a copy of this important new book for free. Now, to set the stage for this conversation, I'd like you to listen to this audio clip about Josephus that aired on the History Channel some years ago.
As we look at the history of the first century, we find no surviving records, whether Roman or Jewish, that support the accounts of the Christian Bible or the existence of Jesus, except for one, the writings of Josephus. In two passages, Josephus seems to be referring to Jesus of Nazareth. I met with Professor Steve Mason to find out what exactly Josephus had to say about Jesus.
He talks about Jesus in two places. The most certain one is not when he's talking about Jesus actually. He's talking about his brother James. And he says that he was executed as a lawbreaker and troublemaker. And he says he was the brother of the so-called Christos, the so-called Christ.
But if Josephus calls Jesus a so-called Messiah in one instance, in the second instance he seems to have no doubts. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds. He was a teacher of such people who accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Messiah. But as Steve Mason tells me, this passage is controversial.
He almost certainly didn't write that passage. Why? Because he wrote 30 volumes, and he's always talking about how great Judaism is. He never elsewhere mentions a Messiah. He doesn't like messianic figures, sees them as troublemakers. So for him to say of this man out of the blue, oh, by the way, he was the Messiah, it makes absolutely no sense.
I'll include links in the show notes to that History Channel program if you'd like to watch the entire episode. Now, when I asked Google to comment on the authenticity of Josephus' famous statement about Jesus, the AI answer that I received informed me that, quote, the overwhelming majority of scholars believe it was not written by Josephus in its entirety. The consensus is that a core passage mentioning Jesus is authentic, but later Christian scribes significantly altered or interpolated it to include Christian beliefs like Jesus being the Messiah and his resurrection, end quote. So when I first sat down with Dr. Schmidt, I shared this information with him and asked if he was suggesting that both Google's AI and the History Channel might have gotten things wrong.
Yes, I am suggesting that, Shane, but I should qualify by saying that I used to believe the alternative view. I thought that the arguments were very plausible when I started writing my book. I thought that this sounds nothing like something Josephus would say. He calls Jesus the Christ. This seems incredible and highly unlikely. But when I started researching and looking at the evidence, I realized that there are actually quite a number of good arguments in favor of authenticity, and some of the most important are that what scholars have traditionally thought Josephus said about Jesus, I think, are misinterpretations of what he is saying.
Interesting.
It's true, he wouldn't call Jesus the Christ, but when you look at the passage carefully and you look at the broad textual witnesses to the passage, I don't think he does call Jesus the Christ.
So, yeah, we'll get into that when we take a really deep dive into the language of the testimonium. But some years ago, I invited Dr. Paul Meyer for an interview on the program I was working on at the time called The White Horse Inn, and he argued on that show that the passage had been interpolated, but that an Arabic manuscript had been discovered that had language that seemed closer to what many considered more likely to be the original wording. What do you think about that particular claim?
Shane, that's what led me to start writing my book. I study early Christianity, but I also study Eastern Christianity, Syriac and Arabic Christianity in the Middle East before the year 1000. So when I heard that there was this Arabic version of the Testimonium Flavianum that maybe lacked some of these incredibly pro-Christian claims, I was fascinated by it, and I wanted to write about it. That was actually the germ of my book. It was a PhD seminar paper at Yale University that I wrote a 25-page paper on it that then turned into this 75-page article, which was rejected because it was too long for an article. So then it turned into a book. So I was fascinated by that. And on first approach, it does look like the Arabic version appears more authentic than the Greek version, the original Greek version we find in the manuscripts of Josephus. But again, when you really start drilling down, some things about the Arabic version fall apart. One is the source. The source is from this gentleman named Agapius. He's a Arabic Christian author. He's writing, around the year 1000 or so. And he is an extraordinarily unreliable source. If you look at how he quotes passages of other works, he's always mangling things, he's inserting things, he's taking things out. He is one of the last sources you would want to trust to preserve something. What I argue in my book, though, is that what's going on is that Agapius is basing his version on a Syriac translation. Syriac is another language from the Middle East, and that this Syriac translation correctly interprets, or more correctly interprets, Josephus's words, so that the Syriac translation doesn't say as many of the outlandish things that scholars think the Greek says, because the Syriac translator properly understood the Greek.
What is the oldest fragment of Josephus' work that includes this passage about Jesus?
That's a great question. The oldest manuscripts of the antiquities, first I should say that Josephus wrote 4 different books that we have. 2 of them are lengthy. One is extremely lengthy. One is called The Antiquities of the Jews. It's, I think, over 300,000 words long. So we do have many, many manuscripts of the Antiquities. The Antiquities is where Josephus describes Jesus, allegedly. We have many manuscripts. The earliest manuscript of the Antiquities that contains this passage is from the 10th or 11th century. That is 900 years removed from when Josephus wrote. It feels like an extraordinary length of time. This, however, in ancient history is very, very normal. This is very typical. There's nothing unusual about this. Most of our ancient writings, in fact, almost all of our ancient writings are preserved in medieval manuscripts. However, there are other witnesses. One is ancient translations. There was an ancient Latin translation done of the Antiquities. There was also multiple Latin translations done of the Testimonium Flavianum, going back to the 300s. There also were Greek writers who quote the passage, and the earliest Greek writer to quote the passage is Eusebius of Caesarea. He quotes from the passage around 310, 312 AD.
And I think you say that Origen also cites the other passage about Jesus in where he refers to the so-called Christ.
Yes, your listeners heard that in that History Channel intro. There's a second passage that Josephus mentions Jesus, and Origen quotes from that around 250 AD. So we know Josephus talks about Jesus, given this lineage of quotations. I'll say one more thing. There is a Syriac manuscript called the 411 manuscript because the scribe left the date in which he transcribed the manuscript in 411 AD. This manuscript quotes from the Testimonium Flavianum. So in some sense, the manuscript witness behind the Testimonium Flavianum is some of the best for any ancient text in the world.
Now, the most suspicious phrase in the passage from Josephus is the place in which he says of Jesus that he was the Christ. Talk about that.
Precisely. I could say a few things about that. One, it does look suspicious. I mean, if he says that Jesus is the Messiah, one thing we know about Josephus is he was not a Christian. So saying that Jesus was the Christ is a no-no. But in Greek, that original passage would read differently. Greek loves the definite article. Greek is always using the word the, which is a definite article, before nouns. And as I always tell people, if we were talking in Greek, you would be calling me the Tom and I'd be calling you the Shane, because in Greek, they're always saying the. And in Greek, it would be much easier to read it as Josephus just giving an alternative name for Jesus. He was also Christ. He was called this name. I think that's how most Greek readers read the term. They didn't think of him as using this as a confession of faith. He's just giving an alternative identification, kind of like how non-Christians today say Jesus. They'll say Jesus Christ, and they don't mean Jesus is the anointed one.
Yeah, it's his last name.
Yeah, exactly. That happened in the ancient world too. We have examples of non-Christians calling Jesus Christ just because it's an alternative name. However, having said that, there are one or two other odd things about that phrase. One is that notice that Josephus doesn't say Jesus is the Christ. He says he was the Christ. That does not seem like something a Christian would say. Christians say Jesus is the Christ because he's still alive. To say he was the Christ without context implies he's dead. He only used to be the Christ. So this feels like an odd thing for a Christian to insert. If they were inserting something, you'd think they would say is. But still, there's another odd thing, is that when you look at how Josephus talks about Jesus elsewhere, that second reference, there he doesn't say Jesus was the Christ. He says Jesus was called the Christ. And Josephus is careful about his language usually. It's a little odd that he wouldn't have kept that practice up with this particular reference, because it could be grounds for confusion. Are you saying Jesus? Are you confessing him as the Christ? Or are you giving an alternative name? So I do think this is the one place that I think a significant word or two has fallen out of the original Greek passage. And Jerome, the famous translator of the Bible into Latin, he also translated the Testimonium Flavianum, this passage about Jesus, in 393 AD. And in that Latin translation, he doesn't translate Josephus as saying Jesus was the Christ. He translates Josephus as saying he was believed to be the Christ. And then we have a Syriac translation. Syriac is an Eastern language. It's not related to Latin. It's not geographically proximate to where Latin was spoken. This Syriac translator could not have been using Jerome's translation. He must have been using a Greek manuscript of the Antiquities. And he says, similarly, he doesn't translate the phrase as Jesus was the Christ. He translates it as Jesus was thought to be the Christ.
Which mirrors what we find in the Agapius translation. He was perhaps the Messiah.
Exactly. There's another Latin paraphrase. This is a different one that seems to say something similar. So we have multiple witnesses, that some of which are extremely ancient, Jerome, and then we have the Syriac one, and then we've got these other witnesses too, the Arabic and that other Latin paraphrase. So I think those are good textual grounds to say that something has dropped out. Josephus probably said what he said earlier, that Jesus was only somehow called or considered to be the Christ. It's a word or two that's dropped out. I don't know if this was done intentionally, though, because if a scribe intentionally changed it, why would they say was the Christ? Why would they change it in a way so that almost all later Greek authors just continued to interpret it kind of the same way? So I think perhaps something accidentally dropped out, but we have Latin and Syriac and Arabic witnesses that support what the original reading was.
So another reason that scholars reject the passage is that it seems to affirm Jesus' resurrection. How do you read that part of the Testimonium?
That, I think, we're going to go back to the well of Greek linguistics, that in Greek, it's not nearly as clear. In English translation, it sounds like Josephus is confessing the resurrection, that after Jesus is crucified, quote, he appeared to them alive again after 3 days. But in Greek, it's not so clear. The operative word is phainomai. Phainomai can mean appear. Phainomai can also just mean seem, that he seemed to them to be alive on the third day, which of course is not a confession of the resurrection. It's simply stating the disciples of Jesus believed this. So the term is ambiguous. It could mean actual appearance. It could mean seem. To determine what he actually means, we have to look at how he uses this word elsewhere. Fortunately, Josephus left us 500,000 words. We have a large sample size. And if you go through all of his instances of phainomai in the same grammatical construction, you see that he means seem.
Interesting.
The smoking gun is when Josephus he re-narrates the horrible story of Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers. And they bloody Joseph's multicolored cloak to show to Jacob, their father, and they say that your son was killed by beasts, when we know he wasn't killed by beasts. He's alive and well, and he was sold into slavery. And Josephus tells this story, and when he gets to that famous scene with the bloodied cloak, he uses phonomai, and he says that they showed Jacob the cloak of Joseph so that it would seem to him that he was killed by beasts, when of course he wasn't. So that same grammatical construction is used by Josephus. Clearly, I think, he's not confessing the resurrection. He's giving a report about the resurrection and what the earliest disciples believed. And this is how later Christians read the passage. Most Greek Christians did not interpret the passage. They didn't notice the resurrection being confessed again and again. They're silent about it, which suggests that it's because they're reading it as seen. They don't think Josephus is saying something extraordinary here.
Do you think part of the problem relates to the way that Christian translators have maybe interpreted the Greek and translated it according to their Christian assumptions?
Well, I think so, yes. And this goes back to antiquity. I think that this way of reading Josephus's passage about Jesus starts with Latin translators who overly translated it in a pro-Christian way, and that was inherited by Western scholars and continued on down to the present day. But when you look at how Greek Christians read the Greek passage, you find something very different. You find that they don't, by and large, seem to have found the same allegedly remarkable claims that modern scholars find, even though they have literally just quoted the same Greek text. I'll give an example of this. I do an exhaustive survey of all Greek writers who quote from the passage about Jesus. And only once in all of Greek writings before the printing press, or at least before the year 1300, is there a Greek writer who reads that passage as claiming that Josephus thought Jesus was the Messiah. There's only one. And there's about 12, 13, 14, 15 others that don't notice that. And of course, one example of this wouldn't prove much, but a pattern emerges over time. And I argue in my book that it's because we're misinterpreting the passage.
Do you think one of the reasons why, over the past couple hundred years, many people have rejected the Testimonium Flavianum is that there was this idea that the Jesus story evolved over time, and then it wasn't until like half a century or more later that, they started saying, well, he's a demigod, he rose again from the third day. So therefore, the Gospels, when they say this, are inauthentic. Josephus is unauthentic. And that it became a knee-jerk reaction based on the paradigm of the last 150 years. What do you think?
I think so. I think that's been a contributing factor because Josephus lays out the life of Jesus and the resurrection account in ways that largely agree with what the Gospels say. Josephus doesn't affirm that Jesus was the Christ, but he says he was called the Christ. He doesn't affirm that Jesus was resurrected, but he says that the disciples thought he was on the third day. So I think this is remarkable testimony against the evolution of these ideas. I think the notion that Jesus was the Christ, the notion that he worked miracles, the notion that he was raised from the dead in fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, all can be indexed back to either the ministry of Jesus or the third day after Jesus had been executed. And that Josephus supports this. He supports the idea that Jesus worked miracles. And then he reports all of these things as things that people actually did believe during Jesus's lifetime or shortly thereafterwards, just a few days afterwards.
In recent years, a host of New Testament scholars from a wide variety of backgrounds, including people like Bart Ehrman, Gerd Ludemann, and many others, have argued that Paul cites a creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and that this creed is an authentic account of early Christian beliefs, and that it actually goes back to the days even before the time of Paul's conversion. Therefore, since that creed clearly indicates that belief in Jesus' resurrection wasn't some kind of later addition, do you think this could remove one of those major stumbling blocks for the acceptance of the Josephus passage about Jesus In other words, since it was an early Christian belief, it's not at all surprising that we would find it recorded by Josephus some 60 years later.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Shane. I think so. I think that Josephus is not our only piece of evidence in this regard to the resurrection being an early Christian belief. Perhaps the earliest and most fundamental Christian belief is the resurrection of Jesus. And as Josephus said, it seemed to them that he was alive again on the third day. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, as you point out. This all happened on the third day. This is, of course, what the gospel writers narrate, these 4 different narrative historical accounts of Jesus and his crucifixion. They all say the same thing. So we have multiple witnesses telling us this. And I think that they also corroborate one another and reinforce the historicity of the other.
Now, at one point in his controversial passage, Josephus states that, quote, Pilate had Jesus condemned to the cross at the accusation of the first men among us. What, in your opinion, is significant about that statement?
At first, I didn't think much was significant about that. I thought that here's Josephus claiming that some of the Jewish leaders accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate. It roughly corroborates the New Testament gospel accounts. But it was one of those moments after reading that passage hundreds of times, something stuck out to me. I started looking at that word first men. Josephus says the first men accused Jesus. And I thought, where have I heard that word before? The protoi, that's in Greek, the first men. And I realized that in one of Josephus's other works, it's an autobiography where he talks about his life. He says repeatedly that he knew the first men, the protoi of Jerusalem.
He was one of the aristocratic member of the aristocratic priestly families.
Yes. He was a member of a very eminent family, a family descending from kings and high priests. He was a priest himself. He was a Pharisee. He was a diplomat. He met with the empress. He was appointed one of 7 generals in the Jewish war, and this was a military it was a political appointment as much of a military appointment. So he was definitely aristocratic, even a high-level aristocrat. And he claims, I knew the first men. Here we have Josephus saying the first men accused Jesus in 33 AD. And then we have Josephus saying that starting in 51 AD, I knew the first men. And it doesn't take much to conclude that perhaps some of those first men who accused Jesus in 30 or 33, 20 years later, were still around, and Josephus got to know them. I argue in my book that I think that actually is the case. I think that Josephus did know some individuals who were at the trial of Jesus.
Yeah, so if he sort of comes of age in the 50s and Jesus' trial was only 20-something years, as you say earlier, he also has an appointment in Galilee, so he's stationed up there. A lot of folks up in Galilee were also familiar with Jesus. So it doesn't take a lot of speculation to assume that Jesus, especially the way Jesus is described throughout the Gospels, many people, in one place, Luke says many myriads of people came to see Jesus, and his fame spread throughout the entire region. So this person whose fame was so broad, it seems like maybe people would have still been talking about him a couple decades later.
I agree. And Josephus corroborates this. He says many Jews followed Jesus. Clearly, from Josephus's point of view, this was not just a few hundred people who were following Jesus. And this is coming from a man who knew individuals who had put the apostles on trial. I talk about in my book, Josephus's commander had James, the brother of Jesus, executed. Josephus's friend, Herod Agrippa II, is the same Herod Agrippa II in the book of Acts who attends the capital trial of the apostle Paul. So Josephus knows people who have attended the trials of certain apostles. And not only that, you mentioned that Josephus was stationed in Galilee. So he grew up in Jerusalem. He's stationed in Galilee. And he tells us in his autobiography that he visited Capernaum. He visited Cana in Galilee. He was stationed in Sepphoris. Sepphoris is 3 miles down the road on the same road from Nazareth. So he's walking where Jesus walked 20, 30, 40 years previously. It seems highly unlikely he would not have encountered people who knew Jesus, who met Jesus, who heard Jesus preach, who were intimately well informed about Jesus.
You mentioned Paul's trial recorded in Acts 25 and 26. And what I find interesting is that according to Luke, at one point, the Roman procurator Festus says of Paul that his accusers merely had, quote, certain points in dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. So we have a lot of material recorded in the Gospels and Acts in which various non-Christians like Caiaphas, Pilate, or Festus mention Jesus, along with some of the beliefs of the earliest Christians. Do you think that quotes like these should be considered historical material about Jesus from non-Christian sources that is much earlier than the writings of Josephus?
I think so. I think Luke is a very careful historian. We do have to be careful when speeches are reported in ancient sources. There's the famous, discussion by Thucydides, the ancient historian, who talks about how he effectively manufactured the speeches that are given in his accounts.
These were the speeches that were required for the occasion.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we know that people in the Greco-Roman world did do that. Now, misquoting and fabricating written sources was a whole nother thing. That was not viewed highly in Greco-Roman historiography.
Especially if you're a disciple whose major job is to memorize the sayings of the teacher.
Yes, I agree. But I think we can trust Luke as giving us a substantively historical version of this, especially because some of these trials Luke was present at. The we passages bracket these trials, or at least one of them, that Paul was at. So Luke is potentially there. I mean, in the ancient world, if you have an eyewitness account where someone says, this person told me this, well, that's very different than what Thucydides is saying. Thucydides is saying, I'm making up these speeches that I wasn't always there for, or these long speeches you couldn't possibly memorize in one go by just one hearing. This is not the case with Luke. Luke is reporting either extremely short speeches or just extremely short statements, several of which he is at. He is a personal witness to these things. So he does that with Herod Agrippa II, where he portrays Herod Agrippa II as not really being that hostile to Christianity. He's not a Christian, but he's not hostile towards it. And what's interesting about that is Josephus sort of implies the same thing, because it's Herod Agrippa who defrocks Annas, Josephus's commander, Ananus II, for executing James, the brother of Jesus. The high priest, Josephus's commander, executes James, the brother of Jesus, illegally, and Herod Agrippa and the governor had a role in removing him from the high priesthood for killing a Christian. This suggests that Agrippa II probably didn't think that badly of Christians, because here he is punishing someone who executed one of them. So that agrees with what Josephus says, or what Luke says, that Herod Agrippa was like in his statement about Christians in the book of Acts. So I think we can trust Luke on these things.
Do you think that passage also could indicate something about the number of Christians in Jerusalem? Josephus says the most equitable of the citizens of that time thought what Ananus did was so offensive that he was ousted after only serving in that office for 3 months. So does that speak to the fact that there may have been a sizable population of Christians, or at least those who were sympathetic to the Christian movement?
I agree.
Even in the 60s.
I completely agree. There's this notion in popular culture, there's also some of it is in scholarship as well, this idea that there were Jews on the one hand and Christians on the other, and they never got along. They didn't like each other. The reality is much more complicated. Christianity came out of Judaism slowly. It was not a one-day kind of thing, or even a one-century kind of thing. The book of Acts talks about the disciples worshiping in the temple, going to synagogues, and preaching to Jews, and hundreds of priests becoming Christian. So before 70 AD, it seems quite possible that there would have been many Jesus followers amongst the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And it's, I think, a reasonable hypothesis that when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, many of the inhabitants were executed and killed or starved to death, but that probably, accelerated this shift between Jews and Christians. But even then, you still find a lot of overlap. You still find Jewish Christians who are maintaining their Jewish identity in the 2nd century and the 3rd century. and sometimes even afterwards. You also find evidence of Jewish beliefs in the Talmud and the Mishnah that are not wholly, quote, Unitarian. They have a triune or at least binitarian view of the Godhead. So, yes, to answer your question, I think it's very plausible that someone like Herod Agrippa II, or that passage you mentioned, that those folks who objected to the execution of James, that there was a decent component of the influential Jews who either were followers of Jesus or at least were sympathetic. They weren't wholeheartedly opposed.
I think the numbers that Luke reports is that there were first 3,000 day of Pentecost, then the next report is 5,000. Then the next time you find a reference to numbers is many myriads of Jews, many tens of thousands. So if Jerusalem is only a city of about 100,000, many tens of thousands could be a quarter or even up to half the population.
Wow, yes. You also notice that, think about what Josephus tells us. He says that his commander, the high priest, the most powerful man in Jerusalem, risked his high priesthood to have James, the brother of Jesus, executed. And he ended up losing his high priesthood. This tells us that Christianity must have been a force of some size, because why else would a man risk his own high priesthood to execute the leader of the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem? They must have had a large number of followers. They must have had good influence. And then there must have been another large number because they object to what happened and their appeal succeeds. So clearly there were a large number of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem right before the destruction of the temple.
What percentage of scholars would you estimate regard that second passage from the writings of Josephus as inauthentic?
The second passage involving James?
Yes.
I am not aware of any scholar who has a research position who denies the authenticity of that passage. There probably are some. The scholars who have published on that passage questioning its authenticity, they usually are independent scholars. They don't have research positions or professorships. So a very small percentage deny the authenticity of that passage.
Do you think that the way he refers to Jesus in that passage kind of implies that he has already introduced him earlier, and which would lend support that at the very least you do have a second passage, even if it's been slightly interpolated?
Definitely. He actually mentions, in the original Greek, he mentions Jesus first. So he doesn't say, Ananus had James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, executed. He says, Ananus had Jesus' brother executed. So all of that implies that he has already talked about this Jesus guy who is called the Christ elsewhere. And if we look previously for a previous reference, the first Jesus that he talks about is Jesus of Nazareth, is the Testimonium Flavianum passage.
One of the remarkable things about Josephus is that he lived at a time in which Christianity was exploding, not only among Jews in Judea and throughout the Mediterranean world, but also among Gentiles in cities like Rome, as noted not only by Luke in the book of Acts, but also by people like Clement and the Roman historian Tacitus. But if this was indeed the case, why does Josephus say so little about Jesus and the Christian movement? In his latest book, The Son of Man, Richard Bauckham devotes an entire chapter to Josephus and argues that, quote, "It is widely acknowledged that Josephus' apologetic approach to the Jewish war explains his silence about messianic beliefs. He did not want it thought that the revolt stemmed from any authentic elements in the Jewish religious tradition, such as scriptural prophecies of a Davidic king who would deliver the Jewish people from their enemies. Therefore, along with his silence about messianic beliefs, goes his silence about Christianity. His silence about them, he concludes, must be a policy." Here's an audio clip from an interview in which Richard Bauckham elaborates on this point.
The key thing, I think, is that Josephus is maybe the first example of a Jewish polemical response to Christianity, which was to simply ignore the existence of Jesus and Christians in their literature. When Josephus was writing in Rome, there was a Christian community in Rome of some size, and Christians were, in pagan eyes, associated with Judaism in some way or other. But Josephus would not like that association. He wouldn't want Christianity to be known to have Jewish roots. And Josephus is like that about other things. He doesn't like to admit things that are discreditable to Judaism. Some of the people in the Jewish revolt get the same sort of treatment. So I think it's a policy which you then see in the rabbis somewhat later. The rabbis, for the most part, simply ignore Christianity. So it's a different controversial tactic. And I think that goes back to Josephus.
In light of these observations, I decided to ask Dr. Schmidt whether he agreed with Richard Bauckham's perspective.
I agree with Bauckham's analysis that Josephus's goal in writing his works is effectively to try and get the Greco-Roman elite in the Roman Empire to have much more sympathy for the Jewish people. So remember that he's writing these books in the wake of this horrific defeat of the Jews at the hands of the Romans. The Romans, by and large, thought of Jews as strange, weird, odd, mysterious, dangerous, rebels, things like that. Josephus is trying to repair this image as much as possible. He's trying to show that the Jews have this long, lengthy antiquity, that they're older than the Romans, that their morals, their customs are not only intelligible, but even potentially superior to, but yet at the same time, they're willing to engage with Greek thought. What this means is that Josephus isn't going to dwell on aspects of Judaism that could engender worse stereotypes, the stereotypes he's trying to defeat. For instance, Jews were viewed as rebels. So anything to do with Jewish beliefs regarding a Jewish kingdom that's going to overthrow the Romans would be right out. So messianic expectations, many messianic expectations, Josephus doesn't want to highlight. And this, I think, well explains why he's very hesitant to talk about messianic claimants. He tries to either portray them negatively or he just briefly mentions them and moves on. This explains why he doesn't say a whole lot about Jesus, because he knows he's got to say something, that this movement is becoming well known. Clearly, Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us that Christians were becoming very numerous in Rome. Josephus is writing in Rome shortly after, a few decades after Tacitus says these things. So he's got to mention Christianity and its relationship to Judaism, but he doesn't want to dwell too much on it. The other factor in this is that if you just look at how Josephus talks about religious movements and people and leaders in the first century, he often says much less than what we would want him to say. He says more about Jesus than he does about several first century high priests. He says more about Jesus than he does of the leaders of the Sanhedrin. He says more about Jesus than he does the leaders of the Pharisees. These are enormously influential people, some of whom Josephus knew personally, but he doesn't tell us much about them. So we're fortunate that he says as much as he does about Jesus.
What are we to do with Josephus' statement that Jesus was a teacher of men who received the truth gladly?
That's often how that passage is translated, and it feels just uncompromisingly positive. But in Greek, again, it's quite different. Josephus doesn't say gladly. He says with pleasure. They receive truth with pleasure. Pleasure is a marked term in the ancient world and in the Christian world and in the Jewish world. We see Josephus use this phrase. He likes the phrase receive with pleasure. He uses it about 8 other times. So this tells us, number one, it's Josephan. It's a Josephan phrase. Secondly, when you look at how he uses this phrase, he always uses it to describe something that is apparently foolish or shocking or overly zealous or heedless kind of actions. 3 or 4 times this describes sinful actions, people trying to deceive others or take advantage of women or things like that. So Josephus is clearly trying to say that the disciples of Jesus had this sort of heedless, overly zealous attitude about things. Secondly, the word truth, again, feels positive. They receive truth with pleasure, but the word is not the abstract form of truth in Greek. It's a lesser form. It's sort of this abbreviated form, truths. And in my translation, I decide to translate all of this as they receive truisms with pleasure.
Could we even say aphorisms?
You could, yeah, we could. Oh, yes. I think what Josephus is trying to get at is sort of basic, fundamental facts, the way things are. Aphorisms is a great term. And the reason why I chose truisms is because it has the same etymology of truth. It can be positive. It can also be negative. We don't have that same connotation with pleasure. To receive truth with pleasure doesn't quite have the same ambiguity for us. So truisms with pleasure, though, really makes you think. When you're like, wait, are you complimenting him here or are you criticizing him here?
Interesting. So Josephus refers to Jesus as a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. Some have argued that this is honorific language that probably didn't belong in the original. What do you say?
I thought the same thing at first, but when you read the works of Josephus and then you read how other Christian or other non-Christians talk about Jesus, I think this should be interpreted differently. One is the word wise man sounds unabashedly positive to our ears. This is a neutral term. It's not a negative term, but he's not necessarily praising the wisdom of Jesus. He might be, but he might also just be saying this is what he was. He was this kind of teacher guy.
And no New Testament text refers to Jesus as a wise man, right?
Yes, that's also true, is that Christians did not like referring to Jesus as just a wise man. When you look at ancient references to Jesus that refer to him as a wise man, they're by and large from non-Christian sources, sometimes even extremely hostile sources like Porphyry, this anti-Christian writer. He calls Jesus a wise man. So that phrase seems much more plausible coming from a non-Christian than a Christian. That other phrase, if it's fitting to call him a man, most people interpret that as Josephus is wondering whether Jesus was divine. In my book, I make several points. One, if Josephus was wondering if Jesus might be divine or not, that's not actually a mark of suspicion, because if any Jew was going to be wondering about Jesus, it would be a first century Jew who lived through the destruction of Jerusalem like Josephus had. I mean, he's not claiming Jesus is divine. He's wondering if he is. But I think that that's only if you interpret the phrase positively. You can also interpret the phrase negatively as implying that Jesus is less than human, that he has the morals of a beast, or something along those lines.
Or like the Pharisees in the gospel accounts speculated that he might be Beelzebub.
Yes, exactly. And there's a third thing as well, is that early Christians across the theological spectrum, they did not like questioning the humanity of Jesus. The humanness of Jesus was very important for them, as was the divinity. That's where we get the classic belief of Jesus being human and divine. So this is not something they would want to say. This disagrees with their theology, potentially. Anyway, what I would say, though, is that how to interpret this phrase, if it's appropriate to call him a man, is conditioned on the following clause, because Josephus gives an explanation. He says, if it's fitting to call him a man, for he was the doer of paradoxa. Everything hinges on that word, paradoxa. He says, if it's fitting to call him a man because he was a doer of paradoxa, what does paradoxa mean? And English translations will often translate this as miracles or as surprising works, wonderful works. But if we look at the Greek, we realize that this term is not necessarily a positive term. It's much more ambiguous, potentially negative. It refers to shocking, strange, and unusual supernatural things. A good word we could use is something like paranormal deeds. Something that, if I told you about someone who did something paranormal, you would be wondering, where did they get that source from? Is it a demonic source? Is it something else? Is it divine? I don't know what it is. And that is quite similar to paradoxa. In the Bible, the New Testament uses many different words to describe the miracles of Jesus. Only once does it use the word paradoxa. It's in the Gospel of Luke, and there it's a crowd. A crowd sees a miracle of Jesus and says, we have seen paradoxa today, and they're filled with fear.
ESV translates that as, we have seen extraordinary things today.
Yes. So some say extraordinary. Other translations will say strange things. You'll find English translations that say that. So I think that passage as a whole, he was a wise man, if it's appropriate to call him a man, for he was a doer of paradoxa, read properly, is clearly not this pro-Christian statement about Jesus. It sounds like actually like something that would come from a first century non-Christian Jewish writer.
Yeah, especially since the, even the recordings we have of ancient Jewish opposition to the teachings of Jesus, whenever you find the remarks of Jewish thinkers from the time of Justin Martyr on, or the words you find in the Talmud, it's that kind of language. Jesus was a sorcerer.
Yes.
He was acting with the power of Beelzebub.
Exactly. You get that also in the Jewish Toldoth Yeshu, this very hostile biography of Jesus. He's a sorcerer. He's a wizard. You mentioned the Talmud, the Jew of Celsus, which is a second century Hellenistic Jewish source that's critical of Jesus, says the same thing about Jesus. Celsus himself, he's a second century anti-Christian writer. He says Jesus did paradoxa, just like Josephus says. In other words, that passage that is often fingered as being suspicious, I think, is quite the opposite. It looks precisely like a first century non-Christian Jewish writer, something Josephus would have said.
What's fascinating to me is the fact that, in our Western culture, we tend to have a hard time believing in supernatural things. The first through the fourth centuries, not such a problem with the supernatural, but those who rejected Christianity often went this route by arguing that Jesus was probably a sorcerer or a magician. And Augustine responded to that objection by saying, look, he's not a magician or a sorcerer because these things were foretold by the ancient Jewish prophets. These are in the holy texts. But it was an objection that you could tell they regularly received, but they met,
yes,
I think wisely, putting it in the context of Israel's holy prophets.
Yes. A second way they also respond is by pointing out the teachings of Jesus. They say, he calls us to forgive our enemies, to repent of our sins, to give to the poor, to lay our lives down for our neighbors. This is not the teachings of a charlatan. He went to the cross. He could have denied who he was. He went to the cross. His disciples were also executed, many of them. So they'll point that out, that this does not seem like the deeds of a sorcerer or a necromancer or something like that. The remarkable thing, Shane, is that when you look at ancient hostile accounts of Jesus, they all say that Jesus worked miracles. They can't deny it. Again and again, you see it in Greco-Roman sources, you see it in Jewish sources, in hostile sources. They all admit this, and then they have to explain how Jesus got this power. And they do it through various means. They'll say things like he learned Egyptian magic, or they'll say he was in league with demons. There's pagan sources that imply that Jesus did do these things, but that it's because he was kind of a demigod, like Hercules or something, where he had this. So they're all trying to explain this, and the remarkable thing is that Josephus agrees that Jesus worked miracles. He's not sure he likes them, but he says he did do these things.
Well, folks, be sure to join me again next time on the Humble Skeptic Podcast as I feature the second part of my conversation with Dr. T.C. Schmidt, author of Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ, published by Oxford University Press. As I mentioned at the beginning of this program, if you'd like to get a copy of this important new book, you can pre-order it at your favorite online bookstore, where it retails for over $100. But thanks to an incredibly generous donor, right now you can download a PDF copy of this book at no cost at all. To get your free copy of this book, simply head to josephusandjesus.com. That's josephusandjesus.com. On the next episode of the Humble Skeptic Podcast, I'll continue my conversation with Dr. Schmidt about the evidence he has uncovered in favor of authenticating Josephus' famous passage about Jesus, along with other fascinating topics related to the historical claims of the early Christian movement. I also asked him a few questions related to the hypothesis that Luke's Theophilus was the high priest of the same name mentioned by Josephus at various places in his writings. And you don't want to miss that part of our conversation. Folks, please remember that The Humble Skeptic is a listener-supported podcast and that we really do need your help to continue this work. As a way of saying thanks for becoming a paid subscriber, we'll send you a PDF resource that I'm working on, which highlights many of the important events documented by Josephus from the time of Daniel all the way down to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This PDF is currently over 30 pages in length and includes a host of information relevant for Bible readers, such as Josephus' comments about John the Baptist and his famous passage about Jesus. I'll make this extensive PDF resource available to all my paid subscribers later this week, so be on the lookout for that in your inbox. Thanks again for listening, and I'll look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.